Hello, hello, hello. This is Danny Ceballos with the Best Boss Bootcamp podcast. Welcome, dear listener and viewer. We're hoping to have these in video format very, very soon on our YouTube channel. So I hope you're either seeing or hearing us right now. And I'm very delighted to welcome our guest today, Mr. Craig Sims. I'm going to tell you a little bit about Craig, and then we're going to be talking about trauma-informed workplaces, both what that means and also what you, dear listener, my middle managers and senior managers can do with this information. So welcome, Craig.
Thank you, Danny. It's a pleasure to be here today.
Great to have you. So let me tell you a little bit about Craig. Craig Sims is the CEO and founder of Amplify Consulting Services. Craig leverages over 25 years in leadership roles with traditional biotech and startup pharmaceutical ventures. Today, he advises executives and middle managers on the importance of building a trauma-informed workplace and its impact on employees and the bottom line. And that's Craig. Welcome again, Craig. And Craig, I'm wondering if you could start off by telling us, what do we even mean by a trauma-informed workplace?
Yeah, thanks, Danny. Again, it's a pleasure to be here today. Trauma-informed workplace really comes about from the trauma-informed care practice. So there's a practice called trauma-informed care. It comes out of public health, and it's a proven approach for practitioners typically to create environments where people that have experienced trauma can go for safe care as well as to heal. And what we've found is that so much of what's been used in the trauma informed care approach is relevant today in the workplace. And so that's what the trauma informed workplace is. It borrows from trauma informed care some principles, some tenets of the practice that allows leaders and organizations to really be prepared to help employees work through everything that we've been through in the last 3 years.
Oh, and beyond. Yeah. You know, the reason that I invited you to be on this podcast is as soon as we met and we started talking and you talked about your expertise in trauma informed workplace, that's just something I'm not only hearing more and more about, but because I come from in a lot of ways, I come from a healthcare background and a lot of public health. And I know how important trauma informed everything is because we all bring our traumas to our places of work, whether it's big T or little t. So that's what brought me here. I'm wondering, Craig, can you share with us what brought you to this work?
Yeah, so January of 2020, just when the vaccines were on the horizon, and there was talk of workers starting to go back to the work environment. We had been working with senior leaders throughout the course of the pandemic, and a couple of our top clients came to us and said, "Hey, I'm real excited about bringing my team back together, but I don't think I'm equipped to handle what they've dealt with. How can you help us?" And that's when we really made that connection between the work that we've been doing and executive leadership coaching and bringing in the trauma informed workplace components and really kind of integrating the two into a very impactful approach to helping leaders and their teams become more resilient based on everything we've been through.
Love that. Can you tell us a little bit about what that approach looks like?
Well, I like to take a step back, if I may, and really kind of define what trauma is first. A lot of people have their own perception of trauma, and we'll talk a little bit about that in just a minute. But I'm going to read this so I get it right. I want to make sure I'm accurate in the definition that we use from SAMHSA. And it's individual trauma results from an event, a series of events, or a set of circumstances that is experienced by an individual as physically or emotionally harmful or life-threatening, and that has lasting adverse effects on the individual's functioning and mental, physical, social, emotional, or spiritual well-being. So that definition, as you can see, is very broad and encompassing because what we know is that trauma is ubiquitous and that it is individual. It's highly subjective. What is traumatic to me may or may not be traumatic to you. And as you know, there's just been so much going on in the last 3 years. There's no way that we can really be aware of the impact of all the factors. And we'll talk about some of those influencers in a minute have had on employees returning to the workplace. I think it's also important to note that it isn't just about trauma in the context of work, which we'll talk about. It's really leaders having an understanding that 70% of us have had at least one significant trauma by the age of 18 in our lives, and that over 30% of us have had three or more. And so it isn't just really about what's happening in the workplace now as people come back. It's really having leaders understanding that there have been events that have happened throughout people's lives, and the events of the last 3 years have really magnified and exacerbated much of these traumas for some individuals, not everybody, right? And so, what we like to make sure that we convey to leaders is that what we're really trying to do here is have you become aware that it's not just the workplace environment today, but it's what people are bringing back with them to the workplace. And
Mhm.
more specifically, it's about creating an environment where employees feel safe and they have the opportunity to heal.
Mhm. I love this. And as the majority, our listeners for the podcast are middle and senior managers. These are folks that have a lot of opportunity, but are also in some ways caught between a rock and a hard place. But there's quite a bit of control and impact and influence that middle managers have, conducting staff meetings, doing hiring, development, a lot of the same things that our senior and exec leaders do. Can you give us some more information, strategies, tools? I'm just so when you go in and you work with a client group, what is it? Do you work with just individual leaders, or do you work with teams? I'm wondering how a middle manager can think about bringing this to the
What,
work that they
what
do.
this really means. Yeah. So, again, just to frame it up a little more contextually, because I think it's really the framing that's so important around this topic. You know, trauma and the trauma informed approach is a paradigm shift. And we're really asking organizations to start to recognize the role that trauma has played in the workplace health for themselves, for their employees, and for their clients. And it's really about a mental shift. And this is the biggest impact that we see when we discuss this on our executive roundtables is it's a shift from engaging with someone and having that judgment call of what's wrong with you to a shift of what happened to you. And it's
Mm,
just that simple paradigm shift where we encourage middle managers to take a step back and really ask themselves that question when they're engaging, be it with an existing employee, someone who's having a challenging time in the workplace, hiring right now, as more and more people are moving between organizations, and so it's that reframing of what happened to you, but also in the context of reducing all the possibility of re-traumatizing people as we come back to the workplace. So that's
wow.
really kind of the approach that we begin to have, reframing the context of trauma, what it really means, and then helping individuals understand their own personal journey, what impact has it had on their life, and then being able to reach out authentically in a way that truly meets employees and workers where they are
Wow.
and really listens from a deeper level, all the while being cognizant of some of those factors that can be re-traumatizing. And we can touch on some of those later.
Yeah. Well, could you share some of those factors? Because I think that's, what would happen.
Sure. I think, we like to really start the conversation really kind of just reframing again or rehashing, if you will, everything we've been through in the last 3 years, right? And so it started with the Me Too movement
Yes.
before before the last presidency. And now it's the Roe reversal, right? And so there's all these very meaningful experiences that women are reliving. They're being re-traumatized and re-experiencing, and their fear for their personal safety, right? We gave you that definition of trauma just a minute ago. And then, of course, it's the pandemic. The pandemic is the global experience that we've all had. And then there's all this, the issues around the variants, and then the mandates, the vaccine mask and mask mandates, and all these influencers on people during the last 3 years that's really caused a lot of isolation. It's caused a lot of fear for personal safety, and it's been the biggest component that we've all shared globally. Then here in the US, we've had the George Floyd murder, followed by the Black Lives Matter movement, Asian hate, the anti-Latino movement. And then now there's a big push against, anti-trans or LGBTQ legislature to reduce the rights of many in the population. And so once again, people are feeling threatened. These are the things that we really have challenging time controlling. And then, of course, we have the riots and the insurrection, the ongoing political divisiveness as we go through another election cycle here, as well as now the mass shootings and just the volume of violent crime that we're experiencing. And overlay that based on where you live in the country, there's issues with climate change, be it hurricanes, fires, floods. So these are the influencers that we've all shared in the last 3 years that we're bringing back to the office, right? And so how does that show up? Well, the biggest way that it shows up is through stress, right? Through stress and anxiety and truly PTSD. And there's some data I can share with you momentarily on that. But that stress and anxiety over time has led to depression. It's led to grief. Many people lost family members or loved ones or close friends during the pandemic without the opportunity to grieve. So they've had deferred grief that they've never really been able to deal with. Productivity has suffered. We saw the data early in the pandemic saying that productivity increased because everybody working from home wanted to prove to their boss that they could get the work done, right? Now, what we're seeing is there's actually a decline in productivity with some cognitive ability. And we'll talk about that in a minute as well. All of this leads to overwhelm, exhaustion, the burnout, right? The lack of work-life fit, if you will. There's no such thing as work-life balance anymore. It's how do we fit these two things together? And then with all these factors, it feeds back into more stress. So we get caught in this endless cycle of frustration, as we like to call it. So this is how it tends to manifest itself with employees. That's pretty obvious. Some of the things that I haven't mentioned here, but I do want to mention to your audience, as a corporate executive, past corporate executive myself, and someone who really is passionate about this work, the thing that we really need to be aware of that is difficult, and if not, we can't really even probably bring it up comfortably, is the issues now with alcohol abuse and drug use, violence at home, physical violence, sexual violence. So these things are real and they're happening at home, right? And they're happening to not maybe our employees, but to a sibling or a family member of our employees. So our employees are bringing this burden of other people's experience as well. So this is a very large picture that I just want to make sure I paint for everyone. It's not just cut and dry because, the news feed likes to be very sterile about this.
Interesting. I'm getting the sense that nobody escapes trauma, or that is the rarity. That's the unicorn, because even the past 3 years put aside, it just feels like the definition that you're giving us, and I think it's useful. I don't know if you want to correct me on that, but I actually think it's a useful insight to assume I'm a manager. I'm bringing new people onto my team that they're bringing some trauma, and that maybe part of this, and again, tell me if I'm wrong, is first to do, the inner work around understanding your trauma, maybe not solving it, but understanding it. And then, as you said, bring an empathetic, curious inquiry. That's what I'm thinking. And so that managers, can say, hey, look, I just want you to know we are building a psychologically safe team here. Part of that is recognizing that many, if not all of us bring trauma. And then I don't know what to say next, because clearly I don't want you don't have to share it with me, but maybe.
No, I think that's a great segue, because, what I'm watching as you describe that, Danny, is I'm watching your inner manager just kind of, chomping at the bit to get out there and to help, right? And that's what I love about you, is your compassion that you have for the work that you do. One of the biggest takeaways that we've had this conversation now for almost 2.5 years with executive roundtables across multiple industries, across multiple diverse populations and demographics on purpose. And one of the key things that we learned early on is that we're all resilient, but we are impaired. And what we're saying here is that the skills that we need to bounce back are lacking in many cases. We've kind of tapped our resiliency reserves, if you will. There's been so much coming at us. And so what we find when we work with middle managers and teams is to your point, it's that understanding that everyone's coming back with some type of impairment. The data shows that there's some studies out there showing that PTSD now is over 121% higher than what it was at the onset of the pandemic. What we're also seeing in other smaller studies is that this relentless disruption and this relentless bombardment of things, we choose to watch the war, if we choose to watch these violent crimes played over and over again on the media, we're starting to have cognitive impairment from that. There's a lack of focus, a lack of short-term memory, and an inability to plan. And so these are things that we may all be experiencing because of the relentless kind of churn of things around us. So as a manager, knowing these things, can become much more self-aware and really create that space for people to kind of bring what they have in a way that they can share openly when they feel about it. I think one of the biggest things that managers can do, and corporations have been real transactional about this, right? They've increased the number of sick days, they've increased the amount of mental health benefits, they've given retention bonuses or bigger hiring bonuses, and so they've been very transactional about this. But what we really start to hear from the workers is that they just want the connection and the humanity that's been lacking for the last 2 years. So middle managers, people leaders that can show up with this understanding can have the biggest impact.
Yeah.
I want to talk about transactional for just a minute. One of the biggest areas that we see that managers can right away become better leaders is to not just be aware of what are the resources your organization has added for your employees, but how do you access them? Many managers know they're there, but if you're on the phone right away with somebody who's in a situation where there's a resource they can benefit from, and you have to say, give me 5 minutes to get back to you, you've missed your opportunity to perhaps help a person. So the first thing I could encourage people to do is not only know what's out there, but how do I access them? How do we get those to the employee?
This is terrific. Yeah, this is great. Craig, so your insights are hitting solid with me, and I'm sure it's gold for folks that are listening. What else can you tell us about being the best prepared manager and leader and engaging with, I guess, a trauma impacted workforce, a trauma impacted team? I mean, it sounds inevitable.
Yes. And I think it is inevitable if 70% of us have brought
Exactly.
traumas forward, right? So I think the most important thing to realize first is that we're not trying to make mental health professionals out of corporate leaders, right? We want to increase the awareness so they can direct individuals to the appropriate resources to get them the help that they need. But what managers can do is by being self-aware, by deepening their own awareness, they can create that space that gives employees the opportunity to step into their own honesty about where they need, and managers can truly meet people where they are. So I think that's the core tenet of people manager is really knowing your people in a way that supports them, right? Yeah.
And knowing thyself, right? Knowing thyself before we come to know
Exactly.
others,
So I think
right?
that's probably the biggest thing that managers can do right out of the gate, because again, we don't try to fix people. We want to make sure that we're aware so we can identify an opportunity to get people the help that they need. And I think that's
Awesome.
really important to convey.
Awesome. So in my head, you have painted a really nice map, and I appreciate that. A map for what listeners can do. It starts with getting in touch with what's going on for you. Then I see the next stop is finding the language, finding the ability to be able to reflect that to your team, your people. Thirdly is to make sure you're prepared with understanding your resources and where to access them so that you can best support folks. Is there anything more that you would add to that map at this point?
Well, I think there's a couple of ways that we start working with organizations right out of the gate, and it's about establishing organizational readiness for this type of work. And where we like to really start with organizations is understanding psychological safety and how important that is in the workplace. We all know physical safety. We're all experts now at physical safety, right? But it's the psychological safety that a lot of people talk about it, but they're not really understand the implications of that. So we also encourage organizations that we sit down right away and we start to look at what are the systems and processes in place inside your organization that may be actually still causing oppression in some of those underrepresented communities in your workplace. So there's a whole list of things we like to review there and work with teams and individuals on identifying. I think more impactful is the second step, which is relationships and people skills. What are those relationship and people skills that I might have? What are my personal isms that I might be bringing to the workplace that may be exerting control or the perception of control over others? And that's a really difficult question to ask because it's a lot of self honesty there. So we also then spend a lot of time working on those interpersonal skills and helping people realize some things that may be occurring that are in some way reinforcing the trauma that others have been through and not really creating a truly psychologically safe environment.
Man, you just opened up a whole new thing for me, right? And I was thinking that this intersects, overlaps, and supports DEI work, social justice work, equity work, 1,000%. So I'm so happy to hear that you and Amplify Consulting are doing that work along. Well, it's not even along with, it's part and parcel of the trauma informed work that you're doing, the trauma informed.
Absolutely.
So love that. So Craig, we're going to wrap up, but I'm wondering, is there anything else that you want to share with listeners about your research, your practices, anything else that would be helpful? And I want to say right now how wonderful this has been so far, but anything else?
No, thanks, Danny. I appreciate the opportunity to share our passion with you in the short time we've had here today. I think the most important thing that I'd like to convey to your audience is make the time to do the deep work. That's probably the most important suggestion that we like to make because it's just taking that extra time to have this self-awareness that can completely shift your life as a leader and of course the life of your employees. How does this trickle down? The great resignation, the great reshuffle, whatever you want to call it, is all driven by people that don't feel connected. And so these types of approaches will help retain your best employees as well as contribute to the bottom line over time. And in going into a potential economic downturn, a lot of your employees have a fear of financial insecurity that they may or may not lose their job or may not be financially secure. So again, this is a real fear that can re-traumatize people. So being aware that this approach can help people across multiple areas is very impactful. I hope that's been helpful to you today.
It's so helpful. I can't even tell you. Like it gets a big green thumbs up because it's been that helpful. Yeah, that it really super helpful. And yeah, it's the and my last question is because I think folks, even with the best of intentions, don't know how to do the deep work or they're not. So I'm thinking about getting in touch with a coach, a personal and or executive and or management coach, therapy, anything else, maybe even some resources that you can point us to or something. How can people start that deep dive if they don't know how?
Well, we're always happy to get on a call to talk to people about what's really going on in their organization. So people can reach out and connect with me on LinkedIn at Craig W. Sims on LinkedIn. They can also reach out to our website and register for an upcoming Amplified Executive Forum where we're discussing this topic and other important topics of the business day. We're having those every other month. But please reach out. And also there's an email you contact on the website, amplifyconsultingservices.com, one word. You can reach us by email as well. But we would love to connect with some of your clients as well and just help them understand what are some of their options as they want to become a better trauma-informed leader.
Awesome. And are there any books or resources or anything else that we can point folks to along with connecting with you?
Sure. Well, if you're in the healthcare space, if any of your listeners are in healthcare, there's so much great data out there in the research literature. I'm a scientist as well, so I always go to PubMed, and there's always some really great research that's been done specifically during the pandemic on the impact of trauma to the healthcare workforce, as we know. Because so much of this is new, the translation of trauma-informed approach from care to the corporate, there's not a lot on this. I think one resource that I find useful to kind of just keep my thumb on is Forbes.com has printed numerous articles around this topic as it's become much more accepted and mainstream into the business area as well. So that's one area if you're interested in kind of the business impact. Now, if your listeners are interested in the science of trauma, how does trauma impact the brain? How does it physiologically change the way that we perceive the world? There's a recent publication out there called What Happened to You? And it's been co-authored by Bruce Perry and Oprah Winfrey. And it's a very popular book right now. I've had some executives that have joined us on our roundtables have mentioned that they've read it. And so if you're interested in really understanding the deep science of this area, that's a great resource to tap. It's very current.
Awesome. Awesome. Well, and just so you know, we'll be listing your contact information as well as these book titles and the Forbes recommendation in our notes for the podcast. So, Craig, thank you so much. So much. This has been tremendously valuable for me, and I'm sure for all the listeners. I'm excited about inviting you back and continuing this conversation. So, part of me wants to say after the next set of traumas we're about to go through, but we're hoping that, we need a chance to level off, I think.
Yep,
So I
we
hope
certainly
that's not.
do.
All
Thanks
right,
for
my
the
friend.
time, Katie. Great to see you. Have a nice
Great to
afternoon.
Thank you. Take care. And everybody, this is Danny Ceballos with Unleash Consulting and the Best Boss Bootcamp podcast. Thank you so much. And we'll see you again real soon.